Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for a panel on data, values, risks, and ethics and risks. My name is Alexandra Slavkovic. I'm a professor of statistics at Penn State and affiliated faculty of the ICDS. I work on statistical data privacy, and I will moderate this session. So our four distinguished panelists today are Margaret Hu. I will forward that so you can see their faces. Let me see. Okay. Margaret Hu is a professor of law and international affairs. She's also a faculty fellow at ICDS and a member of Institute for Network and Security Research in the College of Engineering. She recently joined Penn State and brings a wealth of expertise and experiences at the intersection of immigration policy, national security, cyber surveillance, and civil rights. And she has also published on these topics. Among many activities and advisory roles, I will highlight one that she currently serves on the advisory board of the Future Privacy Forum, which is a nonprofit think tank in Washington, D.C. Daniel Susser is an assistant professor in the College of Information Sciences and Technology, also a fellow of ICDS and Rock Ethics Institute, and is an affiliated faculty member in the philosophy department here at Penn State. As he puts it, he's a philosopher by training, but he works at the intersection of technology, ethics, and policy, with focus on normative issues in the design, development, and use of digital technologies, and how to address those through law and various forms of governance. At the moment, he's also focused a lot on questions, his research is focused a lot on questions about privacy, online influence, and automated decision-making. Our third panelist, Nilam Ram, has recently left Penn State, so that's a huge loss for us, but a massive gain for Stanford University, where he's a professor of communication and psychology. He studies how short-term changes, such as learning, information processing, emotion regulation, develop across the lifespan. So his focus is on longitudinal study designs and generation of new knowledge. Especially these days, he's focusing on developing a variety of study paradigms that use developments in data science and the intensive data streams arriving from social media, mobile sensors, smartphones, so a lot of data, and I think we'll hear about some of that research. And finally, Andrew Reed, Evan Pugh Professor of Biology and Entomology, and Eberly Professor of Biotechnology, and of course, Director of Hack Institutes of the Life Sciences. His work on ecology and evolution in genetics, so infectious diseases, particularly the pathogen evolution that harms human health and well-being, has earned him, among many accolades, recognition as a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, American Association of the Advancement of Science, and the Royal Society. Okay? So I'm thrilled that the panelists have agreed to participate in today's panel. So a bit of a logistics. Each panelist will speak about 10 minutes, and the remainder of the time will be open for questions and discussions. You should please feel free to send your questions via chat, and we'll see when we open the virtual floor. You can probably even just speak up. So I'm not exactly sure, but we'll get to, when we get to the point, we'll see how it's going to work. Okay. So why this particular topic? So to borrow from a recent New York Times Magazine piece, humanity is now awash in data. The premise of big data is that all of this information can yield powerful insights. But at the same time, I think we need to ask, with what value and at what cost? And so our panelists will broadly address the value, ethics, and risks associated with the current data deluge from their perspectives. When it comes to the question of value, some points they will address: to what extent are the data needed and insights gained from analysis using statistical, machine learning, AI models. Ethics, what are the normative issues in generating, analyzing, and disseminating data, and that naturally ties in with questions of data privacy. Risks, how do we think about and define risks in the scientific enterprise that relies on data, and this could be risk with respect to data privacy or risks to the actual scientific enterprise if we perhaps don't have access to the right data. Okay? So this will be our last slide. So I would now like to invite Margaret Hu to start us off with her presentation or her thoughts on some of these issues. I will stop sharing my screen so that we can actually feature, I believe, Margaret. So Margaret, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this very important conversation today. And I wanted to start by talking about rulemaking and agency actions by the Department of Homeland Security that I think greatly expand the risks of data collection, aggregation, and analysis. And I think help to focus this discussion on concrete examples on why we need to be discussing these issues and interrogating them very carefully. So I wanted to give a very timely example, which is a notice of proposed rulemaking that was issued by the Department of Homeland Security on September 11th. So, very recently, and they only gave 30 days for a public comment period to discuss this proposed notice of rulemaking. It was titled Collection and Use of Biometrics by U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. So USCIS that replaced the former INS, the Immigration Naturalization Service of the Department of Justice after 9/11, and combined USCIS with other components of the federal government to form the Department of Homeland Security as a result of the Homeland Security Act of 2002. And what we've seen after 9/11 is a huge shift towards data collection and data analysis for the purposes of what the Department of Homeland Security refers to as identity management. And identity management is a broad concept that the Department of Homeland Security uses to explain that data needs to be used to verify identity, and a combination usually of biometric and biographical information in order to verify identity for border security and other national security purposes. And so in this new proposed rule on the collection and use of biometric data, it expands the definition of biometrics to include DNA. So they specifically also conflate DNA collection and DNA testing in multiple points of this proposed rulemaking. They rely on several statutes as authority to explain why they are expanding the definition of biometric identification to include DNA. However, it doesn't appear that any of those statutory authorities match to give them the actual authority to have this broad sweep. They also include biometric collection analysis of children's data. And they explain that in part, their justification is to use the DNA collection and analysis to help stop child trafficking. Another reason why they purport to expand the definition of biometric data to include DNA is for family reunification purposes and also family verification purposes. So for those that are applying for benefits or applying for to change immigration status, they state that having this DNA collection and testing will serve multiple policy purposes without being very clear on exactly what is the statutory authority that justifies this very vast expansion. And I wanted to also point out that this appears to be a part of a very broad trajectory of DHS in using data analysis in order to achieve vetting goals. And so I wanted to also use the example of extreme vetting to show this issue. So as everybody knows, social media surveillance has become a very large cornerstone of how the United States and other governments conduct intelligence activities and security activities. And so, as many people know, that the government is monitoring publicly available information such as social media, so that, there's hundreds of millions of photos that are uploaded, 500 million tweets a day, 300 hours of video of YouTube each minute, the creation of 6 new Facebook profiles each second. And you had the director of National Counterterrorism Center explain that the work that the US intelligence community does now, they said, doesn't involve really sensitive intelligence. Quote, it involves looking at Twitter and or looking at some other social media platform and trying to figure out who that individual behind that screen name, behind that handle might actually be, and whether that person is a threat. And so fast forwarding to social media intelligence and extreme vetting. Extreme vetting was first mentioned by then candidate Trump when he was running for president. He stated that his Muslim ban was transforming or morphing into extreme vetting. Well, what does extreme vetting mean? For example, there was media reports in 2017 that the Department of Homeland Security hosted an industry day where they were soliciting potential interest in contracts for what they called the Extreme Vetting Initiative. And so they said that they needed some type of algorithmic or artificial intelligence tool to sort through who might be a threat in the United States. And so they said that, quote, the contractor shall analyze and apply techniques to exploit publicly available information, such as media, blogs, public hearings, conferences, academic websites, social media websites, such as Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn, radio, television, press, geospatial sources, internet sites, specialized publications with intent to extract pertinent information regarding targets, including criminals, fugitives, non-immigrant violators, and targeted national security threats and their location. And during the Q&A session, it was reported in the media that somebody asked whether this activity was legal. And the Department of Homeland Security said, well, if it is publicly available, until we are told that it is not legal, we will continue to do it. So, quote, the Department of Homeland Security said, we will continue to do it until someone says that we can't. And so I think that summarizes where we are with this type of data collection, the aggregation, collection, and analysis of millions and billions of pieces of data by the Department of Homeland Security with not clear legal authority. And so I think the ethics are not clear of this. I think that the legal framework that we're going to need to evolve in order to properly regulate this is not clear. The manner in which the contracts are given and what constraints might be around the defense contractors who are being solicited to apply for these grants is not clear. There is a lot to resolve, and I think the combination of this biometric identification information, especially to be encompassing of DNA data, combined with the massive 360-degree biographical data collection and analysis ambitions of the Department of Homeland Security will create a massive challenge to us for many years to come. So thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. That's absolutely terrific. And I was aware of some of these things, but so we will move on to Daniel Susser. Please keep your questions in mind. You can already type them in the chat if you wish, but we will certainly come back to all of our panelists. We just want to give everyone a chance to give their opening remarks. Daniel, please.
Thanks. So I'm going to move sort of in the opposite direction from Margaret. She just gave this really useful, concrete example of how these issues are emerging. As Sesa mentioned at the beginning, I'm a philosopher by training, and I tend to move immediately to the abstract. Because the sort of purview of this panel is so big, the questions are enormous. I thought what I would do is kind of schematically describe how I think the issues raised here sort of sit at the intersection of 3 different sets of ethical questions. So on one hand, there is a huge emerging field, usually called data ethics, ethics of data science. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the kinds of ethical questions that tend to get raised in the context of data ethics. Second, a field that folks who work on genetic information, on scientific work that marshals data are probably familiar with this, is the field of research ethics. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how questions of research ethics get sort of complicated by the worries I'll describe around data ethics. And then third are the sort of specific set of issues that, that genetic information specifically create, and how the use of data about people's genetic DNA information especially complicates the kinds of issues that I'm going to raise with regard to data ethics and research ethics. So to give a sort of extremely oversimplified, highly schematic overview of data ethics, as I said, this is a huge emerging field. For the last 5 or 6 years, it has sort of exploded into a field that is garnering an enormous amount of interest from across many different disciplines. But I can say sort of schematically that I think the ethical questions that data ethicists tend to raise often fall in one of 4 buckets. So first is, of course, questions about privacy. Since we're talking about data, there are questions about where this data came from, how it got into a particular researcher's hands. We talk about ethical worries around data collection generally, usually as questions about privacy. Privacy is obviously an old set of worries, and even questions about data privacy go back, at least to the inception of computers. These questions have become significantly more complicated over the last 20 years as our lives have become so deeply ubiquitously intertwined with data collection tools, such that now avoiding having data collected about you is extremely difficult. And so questions about who can access information about you, under what conditions, and what they can do with that information are right at the fore. Unfortunately, I have to report that there is not much consensus amongst privacy scholars about how we should deal with these questions. It remains a field of enormous contestation. One thing there does seem to be a lot of agreement about, though, and this speaks a little bit to the issues Margaret raised, is that the approach that American law and policy takes to questions about data collection is, everyone sort of agrees, is insufficient. So in the United States, we tend to treat privacy worries as worries that individual data subjects are burdened with managing. So it is my responsibility, according to American law and policy, in most circumstances, to individually manage relationships with different potential data collectors. This is often called the notice and consent approach. And everyone agrees that that approach doesn't scale, and we're already starting to see it come apart sort of at the seams. And so questions about privacy I think are going to remain at the fore for a long time. The other 3 sort of ethical buckets in the data ethics sphere that gain a lot of attention today are generally described as worries about fairness, accountability, and transparency. And schematically, I think one way to think about this is that if privacy deals with concerns about how data is collected, fairness, accountability, and transparency questions tend to focus more on how data is used. So there are questions about what are the conditions under which we think it's acceptable to use information collected about me to make decisions about me as data science-driven tools, whether they are classification tools or predictive tools, as these tools are relied upon more and more for making important decisions about people. Questions about the fairness of those decisions, accountability around those decisions, and transparency around the decision-making processes become extremely significant. And these questions, I think, are sort of top of mind for data ethics researchers and advocates today. The second set of issues is around research ethics. And I think, again, most people here are probably familiar with the broad parameters of research ethics. Often research ethics is articulated in terms of the principles laid out in the famous Belmont Report, principles of autonomy, beneficence, and justice. in brief, these are questions. Autonomy is normally operationalized in terms of informed consent. So when we do research, do we have the consent of research subjects to engage in the research that we are working on? Beneficence raises questions about risks versus benefits. So how can we account for the risks of the research to the data subjects versus the benefits either to them or to society at large? And questions about justice have to do with distributional questions, how research affects benefits or harms potentially different social groups. And the research ethics issues have only become more complicated in the context of data-driven research, contemporary data-driven research. There was an attempt made a few years ago to try to update the Belmont principles. A report came out called the Menlo Report, which tried to sort of take these basic questions about autonomy, beneficence, and justice and sort of update them. In brief, I can say that the way data-driven research complicates these questions is in the informed consent context, when we're worried about people's autonomy, there are questions about how do we get informed consent in sort of mediated data-driven context. So unlike sort of research studies of old where someone comes into the lab and reads a whole disclosure, signs an informed consent, and then has whatever was described to them done. A lot of data that is used for research today is collected without the data subjects ever knowing it. And so when and how we can get meaningful informed consent for people in a sort of digitally mediated context is very complicated. Questions about data reuse also complicate questions about informed consent. One of the great promises of data science, as we all know, is that when we aggregate data, we tend to learn that it is useful for things we didn't even imagine at the time of collection. And so that is a great value and a great promise, but it also raises real concerns about informed consent because at the time that data is collected, even if one is sort of manages the informed consent process at the time of collection, there are questions about how to reconsent people if the data is going to be reused down the road. I think data-driven science also raises complications for the beneficence question for trying to balance risks versus benefits. On one hand, just from the sort of phenomenological, experiential experience of researchers, I think data analysis often seems harmless. Like, what could the harm possibly be from running some kind of analysis on a particular data set? And I think that sort of sense that, I'm not like pumping some kind of pharmaceutical into somebody's body. I'm not doing something sort of physically, corporeally invasive. Like, what could the risk be? And so I think there tends to be, or there can be, a downplaying of the risks associated with data-driven research. It's also the sort of corollary to the how to reconsent people if data is going to be reused down the road in the beneficence context is that it can be very difficult to predict potential risks in advance when we don't know what kinds of data the data we are collecting will be aggregated and combined with down the road. So for me, as someone who is trying to decide whether or not to consent to having some data about me collected, it's extremely difficult for me to try to game out and imagine what the potential risks to me are of providing that information when I don't know what kinds of other information this information will be aggregated with later. And finally, with respect to questions about justice, there's an enormous amount of really excellent work being done that shows how marginalized communities are often sort of the first to bear the most risk and the last to benefit from a lot of the research that is being done in this domain. And so increasingly, whether it's a function of what, people, particular social groups being underrepresented in data sets, or as we've seen historically, particular marginalized groups not being afforded the same opportunities for informed consent and so on, there are real risks that already marginalized groups can be further marginalized by data-driven research in this area. And finally, the specific questions, everything I've said so far has to do, sort of applies to any kind of data-driven research. But I think the question about DNA or genetic information complicates these questions even more. I'll sort of describe two ways it does that. First, the nature of genetic information is that it is what some scholars call networked. So genetic information about me is not about me alone. It is not only revealing of things about me. My genetic information also reveals important and sensitive information about my close family members. And so the fact that, sort of privacy in the data ethics realm and sort of informed consent as a way of operationalizing autonomy in the research ethics space already sort of pulls apart when you deal with genetic information. Because if I sort of am, offered a very robust informed consent process, and I offer my consent and have my genetic information collected and used, I am enabling risks to my close family members as well. And so there are real ethical questions, I think, about whether informed consent procedures really work when we're talking about information that is deeply revealing not only about individuals, but about their networks. Second, and Margaret pointed to this a little bit, genetic information, as with most biometric data, is just extremely sensitive information because it can't be changed, or at least, genetic information can't be changed. Most biometric data can't be changed easily. And so unlike other information about us, like my phone number or my credit card number or other kinds of data that we might worry about being disclosed, genetic information is extremely sensitive because the risks that it exposes me to can't be easily mitigated in cases where of breach or something like that. So some problems that produces, one, I think it just really heightens the potential downstream harms that I was talking about before. So when trying to calculate what the risks to myself are of disclosing this information, I think trying to understand what the potential downstream harms are is extremely complicated when it comes to genetic information. In the context of using, the sort of data ethics questions of fairness, accountability, and transparency, using data about me to make important decisions, there have been all sorts of cases lately where people have offered reason to worry that genetic information can be used to discriminate against us. So information that is collected about me, genetic information that's collected, let's say, in the context of a medical study, could that information wind up in the hands of my insurance company or a potential employer? And might I be discriminated against based on the information contained in that genetic data? And finally, there's just I think all of those questions heighten the importance of data security issues around genetic information. So I think the way data ethicists and privacy scholars tend to think about questions of security is that all of the other guarantees we might make to someone about consenting them into a process, about respecting their privacy, and so on, those guarantees are only meaningful if the data collected about me is held securely. Otherwise, if it's susceptible to breach, then whatever promises you made me become meaningless when someone else can capture my data and put it to use however they want. And so it is especially the case, I think, with biometric data like genetic information, that it be held extremely securely. And I think that the number of data breaches we've seen over the last few years give us real reason to worry about this question. And so for those thinking about the ethics of sort of data-driven, genetics-related research, I would encourage them to think quite a bit about how they're going to keep that data secured. So that's a very highly sort of schematic overview, but I hope it's useful for just sort of thinking about the broad landscape of ethical questions in this space. And I look forward to questions and further discussion.
Thank you, Daniel. The next, Nilam, are you ready? Terrific. And I think Nilam has some slides to share with us.
Okay, hi everybody. Nice to see you today. Nice to be back at home, I guess, a little bit there. I'm just going to talk about a project which we have going on called Screnomics. I think it has some relevance for both what Margaret talked about, and Daniel did a great job of elaborating many of the issues which our team has been wrestling with and trying to make decisions about. And oftentimes those decisions are not one-time decisions, but they are moving around some as we learn more about that. So I'm just gonna start this up here and then show you what a screenome is. So what you're watching here is a very short clip of a person's smartphone use. We take screenshots of everything that appears on their smartphone every 5 seconds. And then we extract information from each of those screenshots. You can see these have been redacted in some ways here that we're comfortable with a research assistant in our lab providing these data. And our belief is that so much of life is now online or done through these devices that we can see all kinds of aspects of life. So the value of these data is that they give us a window at very high temporal density into all the different domains of experience. And that includes interpersonal relationships, that includes health, that includes finances, worries, engagement with health systems, et cetera, are all captured in these digital media streams. And certainly with the move to COVID, the move to online has put more and more of life into these types of formats. So we can currently do this with both smartphones and with laptops. So just to give an idea how that is, and we're deriving a lot of inspiration from the genetic work and how it is that we analyze these data. So here's just an example of an individual screenome. We have a time of day going along the x-axis here, and each row is a different day. So this is about a month's worth of data. And we're currently following people anywhere between 2 days up to, we're trying to get some individuals in for a year now, in particular to see how it is that the effects of COVID are working on people's daily lives and how it is that they're expressing themselves and interacting with others and dealing with the stresses imposed by the national events, as it were. I make a little contrast here between big data, which we typically think of as data about many, many people, and small data, which we think of as data on a single person. And some of the risks that Daniel was talking about might exist more in the big data space and less in the small data space, or vice versa. Some of the risks might be more in the small data space compared to the big data space. So in order to do this labeling, what we're doing is we're applying lots of machine learning tools in order to extract information from each of those screenshots. For instance, we're taking all the text out using OCR techniques and then engaging natural language processing to learn about that text. So here's just a key, another visualization where similar to the genomics type data. And the privacy issues here are of course quite real. All of us, and we feel them whenever we talk about this project, the privacy issues come up right away because you know what you do on your smartphone. And the idea that somebody's tracking all of that information, you're cognizant of on some level that indeed the big data houses are also collecting all of this same type of information. And we've provided a research paradigm in which we're using that for some ideas about beneficence and what we can learn about human behavior generally from this information from individuals. So I'm happy to engage with all of those particular questions. I just thought I'd give one notion here of the ways in which we're thinking about the data. From the genetic sequence side, all those plots which you just saw, time is running linearly from left to right. But we know that these genetic sequences are actually often have quite some loops in them. So we can think of in this between person sense that I have a particular set of episodes which I do on my smartphone on a regular basis. I'm always returning to the same types of apps, for instance, every day. Social media check-in, I run through 5 apps every morning when I get up in order to see what happened overnight. And from those, we can extract out things like behavioral set dynamics. And here's the idea that we're taking this linear representations and trying to find the nonlinear representations about how it is that people are interacting in their particular world. And this is purposely selected to indicate that the ideas about GPS data, spatial location data, and the privacy issues associated with that also exist within this virtual space as well, how people are moving around in that space. And we can derive from those using person-specific analyses. So here, basically, we're applying the machine learning on a person-by-person basis separately, person-specific fingerprints about what their behavior looks like. So in the same way that we can identify people from their gait, we might also potentially be able to identify people from their digital signatures and using this type of data, with the promise that that would help us lead to designing person-specific interventions that would help people optimize their particular goals that they're trying to achieve, whether those are health goals or time management goals, et cetera, et cetera. So along the way here, what we've been engaging with the conversations about the value of the data, the ethics associated with collecting the data and analyzing the data, and of course the risks involved in each one of those. So our ideas are that this provides a very rich repository of digital life, which I would argue is representative of more and more of regular life as well. And that would lead us to new insights about many different topics. So as when we talk to researchers in all kinds of different domains, they see the screenome and they say, oh, wow, my thing is represented in there as well. A new one that just came up was about the amount of light exposure and how light exposure affects sleep. And we have a record here of the exact amount of light that the phone is emitting and the color distribution of that light at each moment. So that's a new level of detail that we can use. We've gone through human subjects IRBs, both non-medical and medical versions of that. We've engaged quite heavily with the Office of Privacy, Information Security, and Intellectual Property. That's included conversations with university faculty, administrators, systems engineers, legal consultants, industry consultants, and with participants and also non-participants who decided not to get involved in the research data collections as well. We have a setup where we're doing continual monitoring of best practices, and that includes encryption, storage, access, consent. I like Daniel's notes about the consent between individuals and how it is that that's done in a fully online world, and whether we're consenting to a particular research problem or whether consenting to general access to the data, et cetera. And sort of also along this route, we've come with very quite active engagement with the ethics, with the idea in a way that, yes, we know that we're pushing these ethical boundaries, and that's part of what makes this problem so interesting. And this means bringing in ethicists onto our research teams. And I'm a methodologist by training, and so I would often come into a research team early on in order that I might help with the design of the study. And I like working with collaborators that are willing to change their design based upon what it is that I bring to the table. And our ethicists are also doing that with us as well, suggesting how it is that we might, they're changing our minds about how we're collecting and storing the data and engaging with it, et cetera. So white papers, potential use cases, long-term implications, and a lot of the stuff that Daniel touched on, we've also tried to come up with principles on how we're talking about those, engaging with them: transparency, trust, justice and equity, non-maleficence, beneficence, responsibility, et cetera. You can read all of those there. The privacy issues came up initially a lot at the beginning, and I think that now we've sort of moved beyond those engagement with those specifically, and are much more concerned with beneficence currently in the way in which we're in the ways in which we're engaging with this discussion. And one piece of interest that I just want to pop out there is the counterfactuals in this realm, and how is it that we engage with those counterfactuals and think about what the counterfactuals are? If we do not do this research, what are the costs to individuals and to society if we don't engage with this whole process? And that's really been interesting for us to think about. So I just wanted to throw this out there, and happy to answer questions about how we're doing. I'm sort of seeing my role here as being the case study of to raise the questions and to make them real and to make them personal, because the types of data which we are collecting are in all of those spaces. So thank you.
Thank you, Neil. This is indeed a great, I think, case study that does demonstrate a lot of issues that both Margaret and Daniel have brought up. Again, I just want to remind the participants, please feel free to enter any questions in a chat, or you can hold off, it's up to you. Our final panelist is Andrew Reed. Andrew, are you ready to offer your comments?
I am.
Okay, great. Take it.
Thanks very much for the invitation to talk, Sesa. I think the invitation came about because I was getting frustrated at one point with some of the privacy issues that we were trying to deal with in terms of getting research done. And I reached out to Sesa and I said, is there any examples where the sorts of concerns that people have actually played out? Or is my work just being slowed down for hypothetical concerns? And I think, there's many situations where the lawyers will sit around and think up what might go wrong and really can think it through. And then you end up having a policy and an activity, which is a result of some hypothetical, which is unlikely to happen. And as Nilam just said, doesn't take into account the counterfactuals of what happens if you don't do some activity. And just to give those a bit more concrete, I used to be, until about 10 years ago, I used to be an experimental biologist working with pathogens in mice. So I used to think of myself as a small data guy, and the data, if I got my experiments right, the data were beautiful. So they are, targeted, they deal with the hypothesis, there's no mucking around, we get a straightforward answer, gorgeous. In the last 10 years or so, I've got more and more interested in human medical applications of what we were doing. And a lot of it is tied up with the genomics of particular bugs, so bacteria and malaria parasites and viruses that are making people sick. And there we're interested in genes that are causing something. And of course, that is fairly standard big data analysis. And you need lots of it to try to suggest hypotheses and find out what gene or genes are causing the trait of interest. I think that's relatively uncontroversial in the case of bacteria or parasites. Nobody cares if you probe their genomes. Then, of course, I got more and more interested in the patients themselves. And my first very complicated issue was that a single patient that a collaborator of mine who's a physician was treating. And I got involved in the patient treatment decisions as a scientist, trying to figure out what the best way to stop this patient dying of drug resistance would be. And so, the story, chronic infection, use antibiotic A, the bugs evolve resistant, use antibiotic B, they evolve resistance. And eventually you run out of antibiotics and the patient dies. And that's exactly what happened with this particular patient. So she was alive for 18 months after I first became involved. And the end was obvious. It was going to happen at some point. And the question was, could we make it longer or shorter? And so we did a huge amount of work on this patient trying to figure that out. And then when she died, we had learned a lot, and we continued to learn a lot looking at her bacteria, her medical treatments, what decisions we made. And so we started writing this up as a single case study. And it's small data in the sense there's one patient. It's big data in the sense that there's lots of different data streams, her electronic medical records, all the drug decisions that were being made. So lots of different data streams around this one patient. And to publish the paper that we did publish required an IRB exemption, which took some persuading. Because she's dead, she couldn't give consent herself. Family couldn't be contacted. So then there was a question of, well, should we be publishing this or not? And it is, no matter how you look at it, undeniable that if you knew this patient even slightly, you would be able to figure out from our paper who she was. Even though we have the dates, just as Julian dates and things, you can tell by the order of treatments, the sorts of symptoms, the stuff we needed to put in the case report, who she was and what happened. And then indeed, the doctors who made the decisions, many of which we were critical of, also know who they are. So just because they're familiar with the patient. So that was a big issue there. And in the end, the Michigan University, where the patient was being treated, the IRB exempted it and we published, and there hasn't been any problem that's followed from that. We continue to work on that patient, learning lessons about what could have been done to keep her alive for longer. Much bigger study we have working now is on the 100 Michigan University Hospital. So this is the one in Ann Arbor. They have about 1,000 patients, a hospital about 1,000 patients big. They have about 100,000 patients going through that hospital a year. And we have a NIH-funded study to look at the movements of every single one of those 100,000 patients, which ward they were in, where they went to for what, all the electronic medical records that go with them, trying to figure out the transmission of drug-resistant bugs in the hospital. You can't do that. You can't see the process happening. So we're trying to infer from this very large data set with multiple data streams what the transmission process is like. And the thinking is that if we could figure out, for example, it's typically higher transmission at ward X, or in medical condition Y, or in age group Z, we could figure out where the breakpoints for transmission was, we could intervene and stop the transmission of these potentially lethal bugs. But to do that, we need very, very detailed data on known individuals. These 100,000 people, we've got to link where they physically were, those data streams, with the microbiology data streams, with the data streams that go with the electronic medical records, the whole lot. And that's the study that got held up big time by the IRB folk at Michigan that led me to reach out to Sesa. You know, we've got people employed on this project. Nothing's happening because we can't get the data. What sort of harms have actually happened from that sort of data in the past? And you can imagine some harms, but what specific examples have there been? Whereas if you do the counterfactualing and say, if we don't figure out this transmission, how many people will be harmed? I know the number of people that die from these bugs that they catch in those hospitals each year. So the not doing the research is actually pretty easy to figure out. I mean, that's assuming we can solve this problem, but I do think we can. The counterfactual is kind of easy to see. If we don't do this work, this many people will die of this type of bug in this hospital next year. And I can give you pretty good figures on that. So that was really where I leapt out to Sesa about. I have to say, more recently, I've been involved in the university's COVID responses, and we have got very large amount of surveillance going on campus with cases, as well as wastewater and so forth. And that's raising questions about, can we tell where students are, where they're moving, how many of them are where? And that's raising a whole lot of very significant privacy issues, as you can imagine. But we have, for example, one of our collaborators is getting data streams from traffic cameras looking at cars and trucks and pedestrians. That gives you movements of people, it's all de-identified. But you could take that one stage further and actually do some of the cameras on campus that the police have. And then you've got personal face recognition questions and all of that. So it becomes very thorny. At the same time, if we understood transmission on campus much better, we might be able to stop it. And so we could very substantially reduce the risks on campus. I think this problem is going to get more and more. If you think about pandemic preparedness in general, it means understanding what's happening in a market in Wuhan, who's eating what, who's bringing what sorts of meats from where into the markets. So there's going to be more and more of these sorts of issues as we go forward. And the value of this large data is going to be immense, but the privacy issues and the concerns around that become quite large. I would say from my own point of view, in terms of the risks, there's a scientific risk that the data gets so big and the machine learning gets so intractable, you never actually understand what's going on. You just get patterns that don't mean much. And you know, if you ran it again or the other half of the data, you get a different pattern. So there is a very significant scientific risk that you lose understanding because of the scale, especially when machine learning is involved. I would say that, and I've not only my own research, but wearing my hat as the director of the Huck Institute for Life Sciences, very large amount of effort goes into making these studies happen. And so people tend not to make them happen. If you've got the choice between doing a mouse experiment and a human experiment, you've got to really have motivation to do the human experiment because it's going to take you a lot more effort and a lot less productive because of all the concerns in the regulatory environment. And then I would say we've really seen on campus recently that the concerns about privacy means that as a building manager, I am not allowed to say person X is the one who had COVID. It's actually quite a challenge to say that person was even in lab X. And so I would argue that the concerns about individual privacy are actually getting in the way of public health and safety in our own buildings. So nobody can know formally, I mean, I can't announce it, who the case was, and therefore nobody else can say, oh, I was near that person in the autoclave, or I was on that space about an hour later. Nobody can do that because we can't provide that level of detail. And again, that seems to me to be one of those situations where privacy concerns are putting others at risk. And I think I will stop there, and I very much look forward to the discussion.
Terrific, Andrew. I personally, this is exactly what I was looking for. Because I hope that both Margaret and Daniel can actually address some of these issues that you have raised, such as, let's say the last one, concerns that individual privacy are basically getting in the way of public health benefits, and what exactly is the harm here. So we heard about privacy and risks, but we never really specifically addressed the harm. But I do, before we maybe get into that, there were a couple of questions in the chat, so I want to make sure that we address the questions that people posted in the chat, and then I will go back to this particular issue. So there is a question addressed to Margaret. Was it possible to find out what volume of comments there were to the proposal? And I think this is the DHS proposal that you addressed on biosurveillance and extending extending it to have the DNA data included, and organizations who may have submitted comments, who basically submitted comments. I think that's the way that I'm also understanding. Does it make sense?
Yes, it's an excellent question, and that's part of why the Administrative Procedure Act has protocols in place for agency actions like this, so that there can be transparency and there can be a public comment period. And if you go to the Federal Register website where this proposed rule is posted, it states that so far, as of October 22nd, at noon, there have been 43,038 page views of this rule, and there have been 5,304 public comments that have been posted to the Department of Homeland Security. And that's an extraordinary number of comments generated within a 30-day comment period for something that is quite radical. This is very complicated, this proposed rule, and to have over 5,000 comments submitted in response to it shows a lot of active engagement.
So actually, I want to follow up on this and maybe tie it a little bit to some issues that Andrew raised. So you said that one of the justification for them to propose including DNA data is to stop child trafficking, for example, right? And to offer, to have family verification for purposes of immigration. But let's focus on child trafficking, right? This is a very serious a societal problem. And how do we think about, I guess, harm versus benefits here? They're offering justification. How do you think about that? Or how legally should we think about this? And
Yeah, I really appreciate that because obviously it's a very compelling problem that deserves a very strong response in order to combat it. But my concerns with this proposed rulemaking is that, first of all, what is the legal basis for being able to promulgate such a policy to address that problem? Or do we need to rely on Congress to expressly identify what is the best prescription to address that problem? Is the Department of Homeland Security just able to, on its own, without any clear underlying statutory authority, state that this is now their method for combating this issue? So that's one issue, is what is the legal basis? The second issue is there any evidence out there that this type of DNA collection will actually address that problem? Or are they just making assumptions that obviously if we have DNA collection that we would be able to combat child trafficking? So without any evidence, without any reports, hearings, that I would assume that Congress would have to engage in prior to, creating some type of statutory mandate for the Department of Homeland Security, this is really without evidence. The third thing that I'm concerned about is whether or not there's assumptions that certain families have to be biologically or genetically linked, and are there going to be inferences of illegal activity for families that are non-traditional. So if a family crosses the border and a child is adopted, if a child has been orphaned and so not formally adopted, but taken into a family unit, in a moment of crisis, I think that how families identify with each other can become very non-traditional. And so, my concern is that, a genetic test might actually lead to, basically exclusionary and potentially discriminatory policies imposed just because of the inferences that can be drawn as a result of that test.
Just want to make sure, Daniel and Nilam, do you have any comments on this, or should I move to them? Jenny, you seem to have a follow-up. You're muted.
Sorry, I have a bunch of follow-ups. I've been sending a whole lot of questions. So I guess one that I haven't posted is thinking about this in a more COVID-centric way. So when people were first worrying about the spread, governments were thinking about what framework they could use for essentially tracking spread. And so I know in Italy, there was discussion, talking to Francesca, there was discussion about whether an individual should own their data and choose who they distribute it to, or whether the government should automatically own their data. And I'm wondering, in the context of what Margaret was saying, and also Daniel mentioned, how can we use your expertise to kind of come at that?
And I also think this is relevant to Nilam's study, right?
Exactly.
Because your personal phones are drawing. But I'm going to I think maybe Daniel, do you want to start us off and comment on this?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think sort of pulling some of the strands, both from Jenny's question and from Andrew's remarks, I think, most privacy scholars and activists that I know tend not to think of privacy as an absolute value, something that needs to be protected at all costs, but rather as an important value that has to trade off against other potential values that we care about. And so I don't think anyone would dispute that when it is possible to solve a really pressing problem, whether that's an acute medical issue or how to identify people who have transmitted a disease during a pandemic. I think there are few people who would say, we need to ensure privacy at all costs, even if it means failing counterfactually to solve those kinds of problems. But just putting that out there sort of raises more questions than it answers, right? Because the question then is like, how do you balance those trade-offs and who gets to do the balancing? Which I think those are both sort of crucial questions. So Andrew raised the question of what the potential harms are. And I think, Margaret started to get into these issues about potential inferences from data that can be used for discriminatory purposes. People mentioned earlier questions about biometric data. I think I saw a question in the chat about facial recognition. There are ongoing questions about sort of what the potential harms of these kinds of technologies are. And I think for answering those questions, we can't think about particular cases in isolation, but rather the bigger sets of infrastructures that we're developing that enable those kinds of technologies. So I think few people are terribly worried about facial recognition in the context of me, unlocking my iPhone with facial recognition software. The reason, whole municipalities like Oakland, California, and San Francisco and elsewhere have banned facial recognition technology is because I think there are real worries about municipal governments deploying infrastructures that enable people to be individually identified no matter where they go at any time of the day. And we know historically that it is often marginalized groups that suffer the most when that is enabled, political dissidents. There are all sorts of chilling effects that might result from that. And so I think in that case, we have to think sort of beyond the sort of like individual circumstance and think about societally what kinds of infrastructures we're developing. With respect to the question of like who gets to decide, I mean, I think here there's an interesting and meaningful distinction, I think, between the kind of research that's being done in industry and the kind of research that's being done in the academy. I saw another question in the Q&A about questions of trust, and I think that's really relevant here. I think when we have reason to believe that our interests are aligned with the people who are collecting information about us, which I think is often the case in academic medical research, right? We think that either the research that's being done will benefit us directly or it will benefit society as a whole. We tend to trust the people who are collecting that information more, and we're often willing to disclose more about ourselves than we would otherwise. And there's empirical research that demonstrates this. Forrest Briscoe in SMEAL here has done research on this, where people express a greater willingness to share information with academic researchers than with industry. I think even with academic researchers, though, we don't want to leave it up to each individual researcher to decide how much privacy the rest of us get. And so this is why institutions like the IRB have been developed. And I'm working with a group right now in the Academic Data Science Alliance, thinking about how IRBs can be sort of reimagined to account for some of the specific problems that data-driven research present. And so I think reimagining the IRB is really important. But what the point of the IRB is that there be a sort of third-party dispassionate entity that gets to determine whether the costs outweigh the risks, the benefits outweigh the risks or not. And I think that is, we either want that infrastructure or an infrastructure like it that will take the decision of sort of who gets to weigh the benefits against the risks out of the hands of individuals, even in an academic research context. So I think nobody is going to argue that like we should never let go of our information, even sensitive genetic information, even if it means potentially solving extremely important medical or social problems. But the decision about sort of what the trade-offs are and who gets to decide, I think, are really crucial.
So maybe Andrew will want to comment, because I think he should. Because one example that he talked about here with Michigan study is exactly where there is an upper body that it's deciding and controlling, can they share, not share data? And this is actually quite well-established practice in disclosure control board, or limitation boards and IRB boards and things like that. So Andrew, I don't want to put words in your mouth. Maybe you want to comment on this?
So I think, Daniel, that sounds really interesting that you were trying to reimagine IRBs. I didn't know there were people doing that. So that alone seems a very interesting exercise. I guess I agree with you very much in the abstract that you don't want to leave it to the individual researcher. That's the same with animal experiments. You don't want to leave it to the individual researchers. Somebody needs to be looking out for the whole. But the processes that get involved very quickly get very, very elaborate and very, very time consuming. So there is a cost in terms of getting something done. And so if, for example, our Michigan hospital project does generate a solution, the solution will be implemented 6 months slower because of the time it took the IRB folk to make the decision. So there is, even though we might agree in principle on that, the practice of it has these costs, and 6 months is, several hundred people died. So that's my general point. I have to say, I'm really struck by the child trafficking example, where you can imagine that there are situations where the DNA data would help with the child trafficking. There will be situations where a child would be not trafficked as a result of that. But I really take that important point that Margaret made, that there might be other much better ways of stopping the trafficking that don't also lead to all of these other downsides of discrimination and so forth. And I'm just wondering whether that's also something you might say of our study. Okay, so the way we chose to go at it to try to figure out the transmission in the hospital was involving the 100,000 data, blah, blah. But there might have been other ways we didn't think about, which wouldn't trample on the, well, I don't think we're trampling, but wouldn't involve so much of an invasion of privacy, which would be equally effective. And that wouldn't be, it might be something out of my wheelhouse as an individual researcher. I might not have the skills to tackle that in another way that might be, anyway, just striking when I was listening to the discussion about the child trafficking that, it's very, very difficult in these spaces because there's not simple black and white issues.
And actually, Nilam made a point earlier. He said, with Screen On Project, they have moved past privacy issues in some ways. So I was curious to hear what he really meant by that, and how that fits into this discussion that it's happening right now. Even when Andrew is saying maybe we need to reconsider how we do some studies, right? To rebalance these issues of privacy and risks and benefits, right? So. Nilam,
yeah, so our conversation has moved a lot towards the accountability piece of it. And so if I design a particular algorithm that's going to be able to detect transmission or some other aspect of, in our case, fingerprints that are based in the screenome, and then that algorithm gets used 7 steps down the line in a way which is not beneficial to the individuals or society generally, then how accountable am I for that process? And just to bring that home is that often in our data science classes, we will have our students take part in data competitions. So imagine an insurance company provides a set of data and asks for better prediction of hospital stays. And my team as a student is really great, and we come up with an algorithm that allows us to do that better than was done before. And the insurance company uses that in order to deny coverage for a particular set of individuals. How responsible am I then as a student for what happened down the line with my algorithm? And I think that we can do better in our training in order to raise those issues with our students. On the aspect of the different researchers, another piece of this, which I think goes to what Andrew's point was, is that it's hard for me as an individual researcher to know all of the other research that's going on and the relative importance of all of those different questions. And in COVID, this has arisen in that there's a limited patient population. And I have all these researchers who are submitting studies to be done with that patient population. Do I do 100 studies that are all underpowered, or do I do one study that has good power in it, statistical powers in this sense? So that's a trade-off where I think that the bodies which are involved in deciding who gets to do the research are increasingly important, because we're trying to tackle something where there's limited knowledge that's available about those people.
That's a great point. And something about with the population of subjects that we're using for the studies, I just want to make sure that we address one of the questions also in a chat. And I think it's relevant for COVID as well, even including what we're currently doing on campus, given the young population. So the question Jenny actually had for Nilam: do your study subjects skew younger? Thinking of the greater comfort with the younger folks appear to have in sharing their data, etc. So can you comment on that? And I certainly can comment later on. But
yeah, so they're skewing younger, but this is mostly a matter of convenience. We're still at the beginnings of this process. We're only just starting to be able to do some more representative sampling. And we have purposefully gone after populations that are low income populations, because in contrast to high income populations, so we're trying to get these extreme groups in order that we can get some better representation in the sample sizes, because the volunteer samples skew white and middle class. So we're trying to expand that range out for the scientific questions. I would note that there is this potential problem that the algorithms that are being developed are often being developed on biased data that is not representative, and that has the risk of exacerbating the existing discrepancies that exist in the way that the systems are set up initially. So I think making concerted efforts that in the data science, which we do, we are not just taking the data as it is, but are also being critical about which data it is that we're putting into our algorithm development, so that we can try to counteract some of those biases.
Does anyone want to offer follow-up comments on this? Daniel, you look like you wanted to say something.
Actually, I wanted to know if I could ask Nilam a question. I don't have a comment, but I have a question.
Of course.
So during your presentation, I was really fascinated by the comment you made about the discussions that you have with people who choose not to take part in your studies. I think that's a super fascinating sort of like methodological way of getting at some of these ethical issues. It especially seems like it could be useful for one of the issues that Andrew raised about sort of like thinking more concretely about what the potential harms are. And so understanding why people decide not to take part in a study is such an interesting idea that I hadn't thought of before. So I'm curious just sort of how those conversations have gone and like what you've learned from those conversations.
Yeah, so it's actually also relevant to point this about our sample skewing younger as well. But those conversations started out in that we were trying to understand what's the relative invasion which is occurring in a study like ours versus a medical study. And the case example, which we ended up on using, is going to the hospital and getting a muscle biopsy, which is this great big huge needle which is being shoved into your leg and taking a piece of your muscle out. That has about 25% uptake in who it is that once they get into the room decide, yes, I will continue with that procedure. Whereas ours has about 67% uptake, and so that gives us a relative balance of what is the invasion which is occurring in the collection of the smartphone data versus invasion in that physical sense. That's where we started with those conversations. But then it went to conversations about what is the notion of privacy for different individuals, and do they think that they actually have control over their data now? And people are very well aware that the big data houses are collecting all kinds of information about them, and that they have very little control over what is happening with those data. They're getting sold to third parties, et cetera, et cetera. And that the notion you had brought up and also came in the chat about trust, and about being an academic-based researcher and the trust which participants are placing in what it is that we can do or are willing to do with those data is important in those conversations that we're having with the participants. And especially we noticed the notion that the notion of where these ethical boundaries are is shifting over time. Conversations that we were having about privacy even just 10 months ago are very different than the conversations which we're having now, in part because of these type of COVID situations where it's become on the conscious people's minds of needing to disclose health information to others for the public health good, and the choice about not wanting to provide that information as well. So I think that raised consciousness on the global level has also shifted the conversations that our individuals are having about their own sharing of the data.
So I want to follow up on this in terms of individual responsibility and individual managing their data. I've certainly, in my research, we also read about this, and there are some, let's say, models where people are considering technical solutions to allowing people to manage their data. But one issue that continuously comes up is the actual education of the larger population, including us researchers, right? What do we understand about, as you said, potential risks? What do we understand about technologies being used, and how do I control the data? What does it really mean for me to opt in or opt out? And what do I opt in and what do I opt out? And if you're speaking about marginalized populations in particular, right? How do we address situation? How do we address these questions there? So I think if we want to give individuals the right to fully control their data, it's potentially a good way to go. And there's a lot of discussion about setting up economic models. So people should control their data. Basically, there is an economic data market, but you need to be educated, right? And how do we do that? Do you feel comfortable knowing exactly when to opt in and opt out, when you should be giving your data or not giving your data, if you have concerns about privacy? So I don't know, maybe I'm suspecting Daniel maybe has something to say on this. So
I'm happy to let someone else go first. I feel like I've been talking a lot, but if I'm also happy to comment on this a little bit. It actually, or it looks like Andrew wanted to say something, so maybe you should.
I just want to give an example of that. You know, I feel like I'm a pretty well-educated biologist, and when I gave consent for my genome to Geisinger to take it, even though I understand what it's used for now, I don't think anybody can understand what it can be used for in 10 years' time. So even an amount of education isn't going to solve your problem there. I think, you know, well, you get my point.
No, I think that's the one of the things that I tend to worry about. Like, how are we supposed to imagine these sort of downstream harms that are just very difficult to predict in advance? And to Sesa's question about sort of like, you know, are we even in a position to make a good judgment about the kinds of risks that these data analytic systems or whatnot pose to us? I think is a great question. I mean, one thing we know sort of like from behavioral economics is that people are bad at sort of making risk calculations generally, right? Like we are all just like very bad at determining the kinds of risks that we face. And I think that's a real question that we really have to reckon with. Another thing that I was really fascinated with from Nilam's presentation was you mentioned how after you showed that sort of video of the screenome that like the privacy issues were just very obvious to everyone. And it like viscerally, I assumed is what you meant. And that seems right to me. It's also interesting though that I find that the opposite is also true to some extent with people's sort of privacy worries around their smartphone use. So in my data ethics class last week, I was talking about privacy and I polled my students and asked them how many of them are worried about privacy around their smartphone use. And only 1 out of 15 or so students said that they were. And then I said, okay, well, how many of the rest of you are willing to give me your password to your email and your phone and your social media accounts and let me go browse through your browser history and look at all of those things? And nobody was willing to do that. So obviously there's like a disconnect between people's sort of visceral felt sense of there being a privacy risk and then what they take to be the privacy risk once they really sort of think it through. And so questions about how you, in the context of like informed consent, how you inform people in order to make a consent decision, I think are really crucial and they're really hard. I also think, and I mean, this is where I'm going to depart a little bit from some of my privacy focused colleagues who would hate to hear me say this. I mean, I think there are cases where we might not want to privilege an individual person's right to inform, to consent into providing data. Some of the case studies that you all were describing, I think are really compelling. And so in cases, COVID provides a good example of this. In cases where there is a present enormous threat and we need to figure out a way to deal with it. I am someone whose political leanings are such that I think sometimes, the good of the whole, the good of society sort of outweighs an individual's desire for individual autonomy and consent. Now that's a very controversial claim, so I'm going to put that out there. But I think even in that case, there are questions about, again, who gets to make that decision and whether or not we all agree that it was a good one. So that sort of raises questions about democracy and who is represented in decision-making processes that might override an individual's own sort of autonomous decision.
And I was hoping that actually maybe Margaret could also comment on this, what you just spoke about. So again, if there isn't either a law or arching body that will make some of these decisions, I was thinking about GDPR specifically that allows basically for opting in and opting out, and I also want to think about the subsequent uses of this data. So let's say that there is a body that somehow legally and policy-wise can make a decision that we should all give our data to address the COVID spread and for the public health benefits. Where does it stop? Who reuses my data? At which point, once they publish the studies and data in a public domain, now it's in public domain, will the Department of Homeland Security then say, oh, great, now I'm gonna just simply scrap all that public data that's available and I'm gonna merge it with everything else that I certainly have available. This is what, this New York Times Magazine article actually talks about it. The company that DHS, I think, still employs, maybe not. But Margaret, I would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, thank you so much. Because I do think that these questions of autonomy and dignity, self-control, agency, the ability to opt in, opt out, your ability to control your data, the things that Daniel presented as far as some of the schematics and the frameworking that we need to take into consideration for transparency, accountability, fairness, et cetera. These are really, really important questions. And I think very difficult questions when you are faced with something like a global pandemic, where you have millions infected and hundreds of thousands dying. And so I think that at moments like this, historical moments like this, the privacy trade-offs in light of the public health gains present a difficult question. And if you're putting, individual rights against sort of, the broader good of society, how do you engage in that calculation? But I look at these questions through the lens of constitutional law as a constitutional law scholar, as well as privacy law. And I think that as compelling as it might be to want to shift towards the greater good, and think about how compelling it is to force individuals to give up maybe some of their data, and to centralize data in order to have a broader analytical frame, in order to do more accurate prognostication and prescription towards disease mitigation. I think that it's so important to keep in mind that the Constitution is at greatest risk in these moments of most compelling arguments to sacrifice those rights. And what I fear, especially with the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001, always foremost in my mind, and how that serves as an accelerator towards the erosion of a lot of data privacy rights and the acceleration of a push towards data analytics and big data governance as a way to fight terrorism. I fear that we are now in a second type of permanent shift in light of this global pandemic. I wanted to go back to something that Nilam said about the counterfactuals and posing the questions: what are the costs if we don't do this research? And I think that is what's on the minds of a lot of individuals as they're thinking about these big data systems to fight COVID-19. What are the costs if we don't run towards it? But my question is, what are costs to the erosion of thinking about rights, liberties, privileges, freedoms itself? How do we redefine that in ways to accommodate these technological solutions? So are we building technological solutions and then, then forever, once the technological infrastructure is built, do we reframe and reshape what we consider to be core fundamental freedoms and values because we find the solutions to be so compelling? And that, I think, is a deep fear and concern of mine.
I just add one
Yep,
other
please.
complication into this realm. I like the way in which you presented the arguments, and I was just listening to a talk yesterday, which was on notions of independent selves and interdependent selves. And the traditional notion is that in Western cultures, we have independent selves, and in Eastern cultures, we have interdependent selves, as a stereotypical way of presenting the problem. And that one could also think of the ways in which the technologies afford the connections between people and how it is that the collective can gain power against authority, et cetera, which we saw sort of in the Arab Spring in the earlier. And so I just wanted to interject that into the conversation, because I think there are also a set of counterfactuals on that side as well.
It says that the cultural differences and how we potentially address some of those, right? So I think I was going to actually bring something up that Andrew brought up, but I think Andrew had to leave. So I want to bring two other points. One is that Andrew did bring up this concern about the data almost getting too big, right? And that we're losing ability to interpret the results. And certainly, I guess Nilam and I, is working more in statistical realm, statistical analysis, and a lot of people in social behavioral sciences, we do think a lot about, once you fit your statistical models, how you actually interpret the results of these models. Whereas with data science and the massive access to a lot of data, we have moved more to thinking about simple prediction and minimizing the error of predictions. And if you think about deep learning tools and networks and models, interpretation is getting lost. But there's a huge area of interpretable machine learning, right? That people talk about, which to me is something that, at least in statistics, we have always very carefully thought about. And I do agree with Andrew that while there's a power in inferences and conclusions we can draw from the, as put data deluge and merging all of these data sources, we do have to be careful not to lose the side of interpretability, particularly for the problems of relevance to health and other important issues like that. And one other thing I wanted to bring up that I think that I'm familiar with, I think it's also very timely, has to do with the census. So many of you may be familiar with the 2020, that the US Census is implementing, let's say, a technological solution to planning to release, publicly release the 2020 census data with added noise. It's something it's called, let's say, differential privacy. And the reason why I'm bringing this up, because there are two issues here that actually I know the census is trying to address here. One is some of their data need to be in the public domain. So basically anyone can scrape it, anyone can use it. But it also means that, that data the census publishes can be combined with anything else that it's in a public domain, thinking about the earlier comments that Margaret brought about what, for example, Department of Health, Homeland Security wants to do. On the other hand, the census is legally obligated to protect the confidentiality of the respondents. And there's no other technological solution also that I am aware of publishing this information unless it's noised up. And they've been doing this for a very long time. This is just a different ways of noising it up, which now, to see the other side of the story in terms of the benefits and the uses of this data, as Nilam is probably familiar, there's a huge concern, especially in social science communities, that these data are noised up too much, and that we're going to lose valuable and valid inferences potentially from this data. But they're trying to address this issue of how do you combine integrating all these different data sources and trying to minimize the confidentiality risk or privacy loss, right, with data utility. On the other hand, what is the privacy loss so-called budget, or how do we determine what are the levels of the privacy loss? They're saying that has to be a decision. This is a public policy decision, and there has to be a separate governing body that needs to decide what that so-called privacy loss budget is. So basically how much noise you have to do, how much. So that kind of, for me, is something that I'm familiar with, but ties in a lot of these things that we talk about, that it's actually happening right now, and that we're all part of. Regardless if we're citizens or not, ideally we did complete the census form, right? Any last, just 30-second comments from any of the panelists before we wrap up? Any last thoughts?
I'll just quickly say I'm so happy you brought up the census, because while Margaret was talking, I was thinking about the census too. So, and I think that actually the census question, the differential privacy question, really nicely brings together both the issues that Margaret was raising and Nilam was raising. On the one hand, I just want to say I completely agree with Margaret that we should not sort of institutionalize decisions made under conditions of emergency. And there is a real risk that sort of like cost-benefit calculuses that we make now will not obtain once the pandemic is over. So I totally agree with that. And I think Margaret was talking about 9/11 as this case where we made decisions under conditions of emergency and then set in motion huge changes to the way data was collected and stored about everyone. And that's totally true. And while Margaret was talking about that, I was thinking about the census, but not the current census. I was thinking about the 1940 census, which is sort of like a famous case study in data ethics, where census data is some of the most sort of like federally protected private data that is collected. And yet, in the 1940s, Congress passed a law that temporarily removed those protections and enabled the US government to use census information to find Japanese Americans to intern them. And so I think that's a beautiful example of where the promises we make now sort of really rely on the trust that we have in the institutions that are backing them up, whether or not they will sort of be reliable down the road. And then the differential privacy question, I think, is super, super useful. One thing I was thinking about when Nilam was talking was about how in a lot of this discussion, we've been sort of framing the question as like, do the research or don't do the research, collect the information or don't collect the information. And I think that's an important set of questions, but there are also questions about if we decide to do it, how do we do the research? How do we collect the data? What kinds of privacy protections do we attach to it and so on? And the differential privacy example is great because it shows how fine-grained those decisions can be, right? There isn't just differential privacy or no differential privacy. Differential privacy can be applied to data inputs. It can be applied to entire data sets after the fact. And part of the way we make the decision about how to implement a privacy-preserving technology like that has to do with who we trust. Right? Do we trust the people who are collecting the data? If so, we don't need to apply differential privacy at the moment of input, but maybe we don't trust people who might get access to the whole data set later, so we add noise in the aggregate. And I think those kinds of more fine-grained questions about once we've made a decision to do it or not do it, how we actually implement some of these technologies has huge implications for which values end up being realized down the road. So great examples.
Thank you, Daniel. Margaret, any last comments? Or?
Yeah, just to echo what Daniel said, I think that we really just need to be very cautious about the architecture that we build now that might, echo for the next few decades. And, once we, build something maybe for the good, and it might be well-meaning, that it can be flipped. So, we need to be aware of those consequences.
Thank you. Nilam?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you for the invitation to come and talk and engage in the conversation. I learned a ton while I was sitting here. I got a whole page of notes on things that we're going to take back to our team and try to figure out how to implement them. And coming from a world of statistics where much of the statistics which I work on were invented in order to talk about and quantify between person differences for evil uses, to all of us to consider how it is that we can use our work for good and for good in the long term. So thank you.
Thank you. I see Andrew did rejoin us. Andrew, we did address maybe at least one of the issues you raised. I guess we're trying to wrap up, so I don't know if you have any last comments.
Well, I'm sorry about that very unexpected power surge in the house. I guess one of the things, I just echo what Nilam just said. Thanks for inviting me. And also I've learned a lot, and it made me think that in fact, there might be some mileage in trying to get some of the folk that are doing this, like me at the user end, more engaged in some of this upstream discussion. I don't necessarily mean contributing to your discussions. I mean, just the sorts of things you made me think about. It would be good to get that across to graduate students and postdocs, frustrated faculty who are, really beating their heads against the IRB process. This is what actually matters, and this is why we have all this stuff. That might be quite something to think about.
Completely agree. And maybe offline, if anyone knows of specific harms that has come from sharing specifically, I guess, biomedical data, I also would like to know. So please do share that. Jenny, would you like to offer any comments or?
No, I'll echo though. I've learned so much from all of you and all the different perspectives. This was fantastic.
Terrific. Well, thank you all for joining us. I've also actually learned a lot, and reminds me that I do need to reach out back to Daniel and actually have more conversations with him, and now with Margaret as well, that she's here. And just to Andrew's point, there are people, at least I know, who work in statistical data privacy. And again, I'm focusing a lot on the census currently and the survey data, that we do try to reach to the users to address some of the concerns, more from a question of statistical validity once you have the data. And this is one example of, we think of different ways of how you can analyze your data, where maybe you're reducing some of the privacy concerns to some extent. But anyhow, again, thank you all to all the panelists. I certainly, I also learned a lot, and thank you for everyone else who joined us, and looking forward to maybe continue discussion on this. Thank you.
Thanks for organizing.
Have a great
and thanks
day.
for the invitation.
Sure. Hey, get outside as well. Bye. It's a beautiful day. Thank you.
Thank